Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Kościuszko Foundation's webinar, Bruno Schulz, Between Reality and the Work, presented by Jaroslaw Anders. My name is Ewa Zadworna. I'm Director of Cultural Affairs at the Foundation, and I want to welcome all our attendees, our regular viewers, new viewers, students of Polish programs. And today's talk is dedicated to one of the key figures in Polish literature of the 20th century, a writer whose works continue to be read, discussed, and admired, Bruno Schulz. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker in today's webinar, an avid promoter of Polish literature, Jaroslaw Anders. Jaroslaw Anders is a speaker, writer, translator, and editor, the author of Between Fire and Sleep, essays on modern Polish poetry and prose, published by the Yale University Press, the author of numerous articles in the New York Review of Books, New Republic, the Los Angeles Times Book Review, and other publications. He also has translated several books from English into Polish and from Polish into English. In the past, he served as a writer and broadcaster for the Voice of America and worked in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor of the US Department of State. This talk is part of the Tadeusz Solowi Lectures of the Kościuszko Foundation, and as I mentioned earlier, it is presented together with the Polish program at Hunter College CUNY and Dr. Małgorzata Pośpiech, who runs the program at Hunter. Dr. Małgorzata Pośpiech is a writer, a documentary filmmaker, journalist, and photographer, a published translator and author of novels nominated for literary awards in Europe. She will moderate the Q&A session with the audience that will follow the lecture. On the technical note, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Foundation's YouTube channel. Anyone who would like to ask a question, make a comment, please do so using the Q&A feature that should be visible on your screens. And now, Dr. Pośpiech, Mr. Anders, welcome back, and thank you for being back here on our Foundation Zoom. And now I turn this virtual floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me again to the Kościuszko Foundation Hunter College event, and thanks to all who joined us today to listen to this presentation. Many, many years ago, two good friends of mine, poets, one American and one Canadian, living at that time in London, one is actually still living in London, visited a Polish library there and asked for something in English, they didn't know Polish, by Bruno Schulz. And as they told me later, the librarian looked up at them from her desk and asked, "Why Schulz?" A rather rudimentary question. And my friends replied, also in a rudimentary way, "We've heard he was a great writer." At that time, this episode seemed to me like something out of Harold Pinter's plays, an instance of masterful miscommunication. But sometimes we have to ask those basic rudimentary questions. Why Schulz? Bruno Schulz is undoubtedly a great writer. In fact, he's one of the giants of Polish literary modernism, perhaps not only Polish literary modernism, but there's always something mystifying, something paradoxical about his work and his life. It's his life seemingly uneventful, except, of course, for his horrible, tragic death. Practically everything that we know about Schulz, the man, we know thanks to one person, Jerzy Ficowski, a very interesting Polish poet, but also a custodian, self-appointed great custodian of Schulz's heritage. Ficowski read Schulz for the first time during the war, during the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, a few months before the writer's death, of which he learned much, much later. Schulz, as we know, was shot by an SS officer on November 19, 1942, as one of over 200 Jews murdered that particular day in the ghetto in Drohobycz. Ficowski says that he had an almost mystical experience while reading those stories, a revelation of sorts. And from that time on, he says that he became the reader of one book, the Book of Schulz, one of those salutary literary obsessions. He became his biographer, researcher, editor of all possible Schulziana, especially his drawings and letters. The results of these efforts, the result of these efforts was his book, Regions of the Great Heresy, which is available in English. The book has been published many times in expanded, amended editions. I remember the first time the book was published in Poland, it was a small, tiny booklet, and then it grew, with the new materials that were flowing in. Thanks to Ficowski, we know quite a lot about Schulz's life. He was born to a secular Jewish middle-class family in Drohobycz. At that time, at the time of his birth, it was still in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, later in Poland, and now it is part of Ukraine. His family was not rich, but was reasonably well off. His father had a textile store in Drohobycz, and his brother was a manager in the oil business in the nearby Boryslav. Bruno displayed very early artistic talents, and he thought about himself primarily as a graphic artist, as an author of drawings, etchings. He got accepted into the Vienna Art Academy, but spent there, unfortunately, only a few months. His studies were interrupted by his father's death in 1915. So he returned to Drohobycz, which wasn't a cultural desert, a provincial backwater, as some people imagine. It had its own young community of intellectuals, writers, artists, musicians, who met in a circle called, by Greek name, Kalaleia, beautiful things. And Bruno was part of this crowd. He developed a lasting friendship with a brilliant woman, Deborah Fogel, from the nearby Lwów, a philosopher, a writer. She was writing in German, in Yiddish, in Polish. They exchanged letters, and she noticed that Schulz's letters were, in fact, small pieces of highly literary prose. And it was probably she who encouraged him to start thinking about himself as a writer. She was his literary mentor. She was his friend and promoter. When you read Fogel's preserved works, unfortunately, she shared Schulz's fate. She was murdered together with her whole family in Lwów, also in 1942. But some of her works were preserved, and when you read that, there is one piece called Acacia's Bloom, you can definitely see certain affinity, certain similarity between her and Schulz. Schulz had no formal artistic education. He was not educated as an artist, but on the strength of his artistic achievement, he had several well-received exhibitions. In 1924, he was offered a job as an arts teacher in the local public school, a gymnasium. At that time, being a high school teacher was a rather prestigious and well-paid occupation. In fact, several Polish scholars, writers, literary critics, artists started at least as high school professors, as they were called. Schools were usually quite proud of such prominent members of their staff, tried to help them, granted them sabbaticals, and so forth. Schulz will later present this job as a nightmare, but it was a cozy job. And he was well-liked, apparently. He was an inspiring teacher of arts. And he worked in the school until the outbreak of the war, 1939. His great literary breakthrough took place in 1934. A small volume of his prose stories called Cinnamon Shops was published, and he became a sort of celebrity, in a very limited sense, of course, a celebrity among the elite of modernist, progressive Polish writers and critics. And it was, I think, again, Deborah Fogel who used her literary contacts to bring his stories to the attention of Zofia Dałkowska, a Polish writer of great prominence, who recommended his writing to a small but prestigious publishing house called Rój, the Hive. In 1937, almost 4 years later, he published another slim volume of prose, which most critics accepted as his next volume, his next step in the career of the writer. They did not know, many of them did not know, that the second book, titled Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, was composed mostly of earlier pieces, earlier than those contained in Cinnamon Shops, with some exceptions. This book was also reviewed and received well, but with clearly less excitement than the first one. Maybe because by that time the critics had their own, they knew literary darling or literary bad boy in the person of Witold Gombrowicz. Schulz's friend was slightly younger than Schulz. And then almost nothing. 2 short stories published in magazines, book reviews, critical essays, but no new prose. There were rumors, sometimes spread and encouraged by Schulz himself, about a new book, a big book, his opus magnum titled The Messiah, that is almost ready. And then the war breaks out. Schulz stays in Drohobycz when Drohobycz this part of Poland is overtaken by the Soviets. He stays on later when it's overtaken by the Nazis and dies in the ghetto. And for many, many years, a veil of silence falls on his life and his works. After the war, the communists did not rush to reprint his books for a very, very long time. Finally, during the post-Stalinist thaw, relaxation, and thanks to the efforts again of Ficowski, as well of another critic, Arthur Sandauer, who knew Schulz from before the war, wrote about him from before the war. He was from the same area, from the nearby Sambor. His collected prose is finally published in 1964. And Schulz achieves this renown of the lost and recovered and great classic. He also becomes a myth, a legend, an object of sometimes prurient speculations. There is a shadow of ambiguity hanging over his life. There are stories about his highly unorthodox sexuality, probably connected to his drawings, which have very strong erotic content and clear sadomasochistic, fetishistic elements, tales about his alleged neurosis, mental problems, pathological submissiveness, inertia, which some alleged contributed to his death. On the other hand, Ficowski, in his writing about Schulz, puts him not only on a pedestal, but on an altar. He fashions him into a kind of modern literary saint, maligned, misunderstood, lonely, suffering for his art. Schulz's letters and accounts of his friends, including those collected by Ficowski in his books, show a slightly different person. He certainly was unhappy. He was suffering from neurosis and phobias, but he was quite well recognized after his publication of the first book, celebrated even by the literary elite of the interwar period. He also appears to a person quite capable of taking care of his career, soliciting help, pestering his literary colleagues for support, for getting writing assignments, grants, reviews. Another myth was about his almost pathological attachment to Drohobycz. He couldn't think about living anywhere else, his inability to leave this place. In fact, he traveled quite a lot. He traveled to Lviv, to Krakow, to Warsaw. He visited Paris. He planned to move to Warsaw. But parts of his life, his personality still remain hidden. There are very few reliable documents or accounts that would cover them. And that sometimes affects the way we read his work. And how about this work? What strikes us first is its small volume. A small first book, and the second one, also very small, produced, as I said, with great difficulty, even agony, mostly by perusing the author's drawers. When we speak about giants of modernist prose, we often think about hefty volumes, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, or multi-volume cycles like Proust's In Search of Lost Time, Musil's The Man Without Qualities, Mann's Joseph and His Brothers. Modernist classics take a lot of space on our bookshelves. Schulz on a bookshelf is barely visible. You have to look for him. Oh, here's my Schulz. So there is this first mystery of great reputation based on a very small output. There is nothing wrong with it. You know, there are reputations based on one book, single book, sometimes a single poem. But this is the first peculiarity that we associate with Schulz. What constitutes this body of work is quite unusual. It created a kind of stir, almost a shiver, when it was first published in the interwar period. It was unlike anything else that was done at that time in prose in Poland, maybe not only in Poland. I'm sure many of you have read Schulz. I don't have to describe, summarize his writing, but we know that there is a narrator named Joseph, perhaps after the biblical diviner of dreams, who is patiently and hurriedly describing his surroundings, narrating small everyday events, while his descriptions transform everything in his view into some kind of magical reality. Objects, people, places assume additional dimensions, change identity, become something more than meets the eye. Inanimate objects become animate. Burdock cabbage heads become enormous witches, disrobing in broad daylight, and apricots shelter the core of long afternoons, and chandeliers blacken and wilt like old thistles. House interiors cannot find peace above their own agitated, dark past. Wallpaper whispers, hisses, lisps. Unmade beds stand like deep boats ready to sail off into the damp, tortuous labyrinths of some black, starless Venice. Familiar streets or house interiors also turn into labyrinths, leading to most unexpected places. Labyrinth is a frequent, recurrent motif in Schulz's prose. Time splits circles, slows down, jumps forward, especially in the story Sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass, which is probably the most complex of Schulz's works, and is about time and death, and attempts to cheat both. There are no plots or heroes in the conventional sense. There are certain motifs, themes that keep coming back, a magical journey, a contrast between the old and the new, between the old-fashioned, noble, distinguished cinnamon stores and the Street of Crocodiles, also a title of a story, a district of corruption, illicit pleasures, trash that represents the new era. But even those themes constantly shift. They start and disappear. They do not reach any clear conclusion. We are in some very deeply personal, lyrical, and mystic universe. This universe seems to be ruled by the narrator's father, named Jacob as the father of the biblical Joseph, and also as Schulz's real father. He's always portrayed through Joseph's eyes as a magician conducting strange experiments in the unexplored regions of existence. He fascinates his son as someone who has touched the roots of existence, a magician capable of conjuring unknown forms of life, perhaps a prophet of a new religion. The relationship of Joseph towards Jacob is one of adoration and awe rather than love. Quite often Jacob appears as distant, inaccessible, even a bit frightening, and not entirely real, perhaps already dead, perhaps merely imagined. Joseph sees him, senses his presence in a stuffed bird, a giant cockroach, even a cooked crab. In Sanatorium under sign of the hourglass, Jacob is already dead and still alive. He's dying, lingering between life and death, and sometimes appears as an energetic businessman pursuing his new ventures. Another recurring figure in the fiction, Schulz's fiction, is slim-legged Adela. That's how she's usually presented, slim-legged Adela, the maid apparently in Jacob's house, who introduces erotic tension into Joseph's and Jacob's world and repeatedly spoils the father's magic. Occasionally we encounter also Joseph's mother as an affectionate but uncomprehending and rather dull woman. It is interesting that Schulz, who met and was helped by so many strong, intelligent, artistically gifted women, Deborah Fogel, Naukowska, and there were others in the meantime, presents women in his writing and in his drawings also, almost invariably as representatives of matter, flesh. They are powerful, they are indomitable, but they are the downward pull on men. They are enemies of the spirit, destroyers of magic. Joseph is also a kind of apprentice magician, conducting his own experiments with imagination and reality. Wandering through a garden, he encounters a sylvan deity. He spies on a retarded girl who in her trance appears to him like a pagan, like a little pagan idol. He adores a beautiful girl named Bianca, who is sometimes a divine creature, something like Dante's Beatrice, and sometimes a vulgar temptress who spoils Joseph's dreams. He rides to a winter landscape in a cart drawn by a horse, which dies at the end of the journey and turns into a toy. The narrator sometimes appears as an alchemist, showing us around his laboratory, bringing to our attention various concoctions bubbling in various vials, but also careful not to tell us too much because we're not ready. We haven't been properly initiated. So critics who wrote about Schulz, especially right after the publication of his first book, were fascinated but confused. Even those who did not like the book or decided that for one reason or another, this kind of prose should not be liked, were at least intrigued. Is it a fairy tale, a world seen through the eyes of a child, when everything is new, appears as magic? Is Schulz trying to recreate this ideal world as an escape from reality? But Schulz's world is not entirely innocent or idyllic. There is a lot of sexuality in it, a lot of dark corners with vague menace lurking there. Is he a late symbolist, a throwback to Młoda Polska, the young Poland, the Polish fin de siècle movement of the turn of the century? Perhaps an expressionist. Expressionism was a predominantly German style characterized by sharp, aggressive metaphors, caricature, grotesquerie. yes, there is something of it in Schulz. A surrealist, well, André Breton in his second surrealist manifesto writes about a perception where, I quote, life and death, the real and the imaginary, the past and the future, the communicable and incommunicable, the high and the low cease to be seen as contradictory. Well, that is pretty close. In fact, some critics, most notably Arthur Sandauer, do see Schulz as a surrealist, perhaps the only real surrealist in Polish literature. But surrealists often took a complete leave of reality, constructing their own irrational universes. Critics notice that Schulz never crosses the line into pure absurdity. His world, however transformed, is still recognizable. Someone familiar with pre-war Drohobycz could probably trace Joseph's peregrinations on the map, and there were actually such efforts made. There's also some kind of logic, consistency, a set of rules perhaps in his experiments. Surrealists rejected any kind of logic, consistency, rules, and as to constraining. We are talking about a period when modernist trends were already quite present in Poland, especially in poetry and also in prose. They came to Poland mainly through French and German influences, and to much lesser extent English. I mentioned the turn of century young Poland, symbolist. There were grotesque, uncanny, hyperbolic plays and novels with philosophical, sometimes political subtexts by Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, who was older than Schulz, and he was one of his early admirers. There were other younger experimenters who, with discontinued narratives, unreliable narrator, metafiction, in which the narrator reveals that he or she is telling a fictitious story, speculates on the process of storytelling, enters into a dialogue with readers, sometimes even his own characters. There were examples of the stream of consciousness technique too, but nothing quite like Schulz. Polish literary critics in the second half of the interwar period were probably, on the average, more conservative than Polish writers, Polish literature was. Not necessarily conservative in the political sense, but conservative in their notions about what literature is, what the proper role of literature should be. It was a difficult and uncertain time in Poland. There were economic problems, social problems, political problems. The country was sliding into authoritarianism. There were nationality tensions, international tensions. Both Germany and Russia were resurgent, and it was clear that they both have designs on Poland. And many critics expected a literature, especially the novel, to tackle those social public problems. And even those who did not, who accepted the autonomy of art and literature, were asking for an overlying subject, an issue, a theme, an idea, some motivation behind Schulz's creation, some kind of intellectual framework on which to hang it all. What is the author doing, really, and why? And as if to help the critics, the author published in 1936 an essay titled The Mythologizing of Reality. And many accepted it very quickly and gratefully as Schulz's literary program, or at least his self-interpretation. The essence of reality, writes Schulz, and I quote, is meaning or sense. Every fragment of reality lives by virtue of partaking in a universal sense. End of quote. But we humans have lost contact with this sense. There was a time, says Schulz, when every word contained the universal sense. a great universal whole, he calls it. But words are striving, still striving to regain it by reaching in many different directions. Schulz uses the symbol of a wriggling pieces of a cut-up snake. Out of the striving, this constant search for the great whole, poetry is born. Schulz says in the essay that poetry happens, I quote again, poetry happens when short circuit of sense occurs between words, a sudden regeneration of the primeval myth. The poet is trying to recover this primeval myth by borrowing among ancient narratives, stories that still linger in our subconsciousness. And all this is happening in and through language, within language, because language, again, I quote Schulz, language is a man's metaphysical organ, because reality is the reflection, the shadow of the world, and not the other way around. So this is the old ancient myth of the logos spermatikos, the seminal word from which everything else begins. What we have in this essay, I think, is an interesting and very modern definition of poetry, the sudden quickening, excitement, animation within language that starts to reach in many directions, discovers unexpected links, associations, this semantic short circuits. On the other hand, it seems that Schulz means something else and something more. He presents writing as a metaphysical endeavor. He speaks as a mystic. The ultimate sense, the great universal whole, the primeval myth are somewhere there, either hidden in the visible world or echoing within ancient narratives, or perhaps still hidden deep in the deeper layers of our mind. Whatever it is there, and we can at least strive to uncover, to recover it through the use of the metaphysical organ of the language. In the story Spring, Schulz encourages us, the readers, to descend into the labyrinths of depth, labyrinths again, where a great many old tales and ancient sagas have been collected, where too many whispers have been gathered underground, inarticulate pulp and dark nameless things that existed before words. That's quite powerful. In the story, the book, Joseph is convinced that some time ago in his early childhood, he was in the possession of the original logos in the form of a mysterious book that nobody seems to remember. And he writes, sometimes the book slept and the wind blew it apart silently like a centifolia rose and opened its little leaves, petal by petal, eyelids by eyelid, all of them blind, velvety, dormant, concealing in their core, on the very bottom, an azure pupil, a peacock heart, a screeching nest of hummingbirds. There were never, I think, hummingbirds in Drohobycz, but there is, they make the screeching sound sometimes, so Schulz got it very right. So we know that we should take a writer's self-interpretations with a grain of salt, but of course we cannot ignore them either. And they said many Schulz's admirers accepted the concept of mythologizing of reality, of the search for the original myth, the ultimate sense, as his program, the idea, the intellectual structure behind his writing. Were they right? I'm not so sure. When you look at Schulz's world closely, this world is indeed magical, radiant. It postulates a unity of matter and spirit, a life force that is penetrating, flowing through inanimate objects, a kind of elan. that constantly transforms and enlivens it. It is great poetry in prose. And you do find it in fragments of echoes, and you do find in the fiction, in the prose, fragments of echoes, myths, of Ovid's metamorphoses, of biblical stories, and of course of Jewish mysticism. But how about the ultimate sense, the great mystery, the whole? Does it at least glimmer somewhere among Schulz's visions? Now, I must confess, I'm a deeply non-mystical person. I can only look at Schulz as a literary text, and it is hard for me to detect among those enchanting transformations any clear direction, any central symbol or allegory that we usually associate with mystical writing. His visions develop in a series of impressionistic images that never cohere, in my view, into a larger pattern suggestive of a deeper metaphysical order. His language definitely renews the world, but what it communicates is not really a philosophical or religious concept, but a life experienced in a very intense, sensual, aesthetic, visceral way. In one of his letters, Schulz admits of being, in his own words, a parasite of metaphors. I allow myself to be carried away by the first metaphor that comes along, and only with difficulty can I call myself back to return to my senses. So he gets on this train of metaphors and is carried by it, and it goes on and on and on. And indeed, Schulz himself seems to treat his own grand program, metaphysical program, with a measure of distrust and perhaps even self-irony. Even sometimes subtly undermines it in his own writing. His magical kingdom has something rather unstable, impermanent about them. It seems to be always on the verge of collapse, self-parody. Many critics notice a close proximity of magic and trashiness in his writing. These two often seamlessly flowing from one into the other. When in the story, The Street of Crocodiles, the district of cheap pleasures, he writes how it vibrates with the same light, the same enchantment as Joseph's childhood memories. In a sense, he represents the reverse side of imagination, the ability to ennoble, elevate, if only momentarily, the world of corruption and putrefaction, and turn into something enchanting and grandiose. Apart from the mythization of reality, there exists another piece of Schulz's writing, perhaps even more significant and somehow contradictory to the former, that can also be read as the author's self-commentary. It is the story essay treatise on Taylor's Dummies, or the second book of Genesis contained in the cinnamon shops. In a lecture delivered to Adela and two seamstress girls, Jacob, the father, states that creation is a privilege of all spirits, and men can claim the role of the demiurge, his partner or even competitor, by breathing his own spirit into the world. But there is one problem. The original recipes used by the demiurge may be beyond man's reach. But that's okay, says the father. Even if the divine methods are inaccessible to mortals, to us mortals, there, quote, there still remain certain illegal methods, an infinity of heretical, extreme methods. They consist of giving priority to trash, as the material of creation. Colored tissue, he says, papier-mâché, lacquer print, scraggy hair, and sawdust. Man's creativity, the father suggests, belongs to the lower sphere, where he calls it generatio equivoca, creation in name only, which results in short-lived forms. His terms again, beautiful rash, a fantastic coating, a colorful, lushly flourishing mold. In another story, Second Fall, the father compares beauty to a disease, the result of a mysterious infection, a dark forerunner of decomposition, which rises from the depth of perfection and is saluted by perfection with signs of the deepest bliss. If this is, as many critics agree, Schulz's thinking about the role and the position of an artist, including himself, it is a rather pessimistic view. If the demiurge, the mythical creator of the visible world, the imperfect world, is a lesser god, because the true God, the perfect God, could not create something as imperfect as our world. He's the lesser God. The artist is a lesser demiurge, condemned to work with shabby materials, creating unstable, perishable forms. This is a far cry from the image of an artist as the high priest, a prophet in search of the ultimate sense, the original knowledge. And it sounds very, very contemporary. It brings to one's mind the found object art, sculptures or installations made literally out of trash, objects that are supposed to disintegrate on their own or are meant to be destroyed at some point. In other words, it sounds very postmodern. And some critics actually consider Schulz as a forerunner of postmodernism. But on the other hand, we have the Schulz of the mythologizing of reality, the Schulz that is clearly belonging to what we call high modernism, that treated art very seriously, almost as a surrogate religion. Postmodernism tends to mock those aspirations, treats art as a game, even a bit of a trickery, deception, sleight of hand. And it's often obsessed with the lower regions, with the shabby, with the artificiality. So we have the modernist Schulz and we have the perhaps postmodernist Schulz, two visions, two concepts of art and the artists. And there is some tension between the word, the metaphysical organ, and reality that accosts us, in fact, seduces us, with the shabby, impermanent, make-believe. And I personally find this duality quite fascinating. A lot of great art and literature, especially in the modernist period, has this inner dialogue running through it, as if the author simultaneously believed and doubted his own omnipotence or the power of heroic, liberating imagination. In The Street of Crocodiles, Schulz says, having exceeded a certain point of tension, the tide stops and begins to ebb. The atmosphere becomes unclear and troubled. Possibilities fade and decline into a void. He says this about the Street of Crocodiles, the symbol of the corrupt, degraded world, but at the same time, the same tides and ebbs can be felt, can be detected throughout his writing. The magical horse turns out to be a toy. Jacob rises to the rank of God's competitor and then shrinks to the size of a cockroach. And the book, the fountain of everything, turns out to be a bound volume of a trashy illustrated magazine that Adela uses as wrapping paper. That woman again, destroying the mystery, page after page after page. Well, as I said, I find this dichotomy fascinating and enriching, definitely not a weakness or a fault. But how about Schulz the man. Is it possible that this tension affected him personally? The sense that there is no epiphany at the end of the road, no ultimate sense. Is it why he could not write? We know from his letters and his friends' accounts that he lived through an intense mental crisis after he started publishing his prose. We know from his letters that he blamed it on the conditions of his life, on his duties, his obligations, his job, his health, his loneliness. But most of all, he felt trapped inside himself. He was trying to break out of the chrysalis, as he called it. He hoped that his marriage will be a new beginning. At some time, apparently he and Deborah Fogel considered a marriage that never came to the stage of planning, actually, but his real fiancée, Józefina Szelińska, she was also a school teacher from whom Schulz met in 1933. She was from a Jewish family, but her parents converted to Christianity, and she was raised as a Christian. And it looked serious. In order to be able to marry her, Schulz left the Jewish community. The marriage was supposed to take place in Silesia, where Christians were allowed to marry people without any religious affiliation, but not Jews. The marriage did not take place. Józefina survived the war and died of suicide, I think, in 1991 in Gdańsk, where she worked as a librarian. In one of his letters, he confided to a friend that my fiancée constitutes my participation in life. Through her, I'm a person, not just a lemur of a kobold. And he confesses to being lost in inhuman realms, barren underworlds of fantasy. Something strange was going on. Well, of course, the last years of his life were a nightmare for reasons having nothing to do with literature. First, the Soviet occupation of Drohobycz. Schulz agreed, some say volunteered, to work for the local propaganda office, painting communist posters. Later, under the Nazis, he became a kind of house slave of an SS officer, Felix Landau, an Austrian, who liked his paintings and made him decorate the room of his little son with fairy tale scenes. This image is so perverse and so horrifying that it makes me cringe whenever I imagine it. According to all accounts, Landau was a monster. He killed people for pleasure, for sport, for target practice. But he probably protected Schulz for a while, until the fateful night of November 1942. Landau was arrested after the war. He escaped. He was arrested again in 1959. He was sentenced to life, pardoned in 1973, and died in 1983. After the war, Schulz, as I say, became part of the canon of Polish literature. He inspired film and theater adaptations, musical compositions, and of course, visual arts. He appears as a character or a point of reference in several poems and works of fiction, most notably perhaps in Cynthia Ozick's The Messiah of Stockholm. As for strictly literary influences, his style and vision was probably too personal and too unique to invite followers. There was one case of attempted imitation in his own time between the wars, a completely unfortunate case bordering of plagiarism. Only recently, his influences can be traced among Polish authors working in the magical realism vein, especially Magdalena Tully and, of course, the Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk. I was recently reading her Księgi Jakubowe, the books of Jacob, which I think hasn't been published in English yet. It should soon. A strange thought flashed through my mind. Is she trying to write the Messiah, the Schulz's missing book? Many of you have read, will read Schulz in the English translation. A word about translation, though. It is extremely difficult to assimilate his style into any other language, especially contemporary English. What decides about his originality, strangeness, lyrical quality, in his Polish style, long chains of adjectives, Baroque effusions, long compound sentences, unusual syntax, is not what is considered good, clear style in English. It is hard to find an equivalent, an English equivalent that would convey or even imitate those qualities. We are lucky to have two translations of Schulz's prose to compare. There are more than two, but these two are probably best well known and the best in general. The first one, the one that introduced Schulz to the English language audience, is by Sedina Wieniewska. In 1963, she published her translation of Cinnamon Shops in London. The same year, the book appeared in America as The Street of Crocodiles. Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, the second book in her translation, was published in 1978. Wieniewska tried to keep some of Schulz's idiosyncrasies, while at the same time making the translation reasonably readable, accessible, to an English reader. She left some elements out. She made his sentences simpler, shorter. Some images became more specific, easier to visualize. And as could be expected, she was criticized from both sides. A reviewer from the Times Literary Supplement chastised her for wordiness, mannerism, a work a shade too gratuitous and uncontrolled, he wrote. Another critic was writing about too much of formula-adorned prose, gilded prose. On the other hand, those who knew Schulz in Polish and knew Polish criticized her for making Schulz sound too smooth, too ordinary. There is a more recent translation published in 2018 by Northwestern University Press by Madeleine Levine. She based her translation on a critical scholarly edition of Schulz published in Poland in 1989. And as she explains in the translator's note, she attempted to get closer to the texture of Schulz's prose by stretching English syntax a little bit to make it, to accommodate the sinuosity of Schulz's longer sentences. That's how she describes it, rather than reining them in. And I must say, I like this translation very much. Levine is a splendid translator of, among other things, the prose of Czesław Miłosz, Miron Bielszewski, Tadeusz Borowski, and others. Why Schulz? For me, one of the most fascinating things about Schulz is the fact that he's constantly posing us questions that we're usually unable to answer. Was he a mystic? I've stated my doubts. He was not a myth maker in the sense that Blake was, or Mickiewicz, or Yeats closer to our times. They created myths to express their understanding of a metaphysical order. I do not see that in him, but he was a person of a mythical mind, in the sense that the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer used the term. Cassirer believed that mythical thinking is the original way of looking at the world, seeing it as a continuous entity, permeated with inner power, inner radiance that makes the common, the ordinary appear magical. Schulz was a poet that liberated this mode of perception from rationalistic constraints and created worlds we can believe in, although we sometimes cannot say why. We can read him in so many ways, approach him from different angles. Psychoanalysis, one of the fertile grounds for Schulz analysis. I've recently listened to an interview with Anna Freilich, a wonderful Polish poet, a professor of Polish literature, now retired at Columbia University, and a good friend of mine. And she said that when she was teaching Schulz to American students, they could find much more in him than Polish critics. We are probably too determined, shaped by certain prevailing lines of argumentation. And it is sometimes good to step out, to look at him through a different angle, to put aside all theories, doctrines that are imposing themselves. Commentary on Schulz very often turns into literature itself, into figurative, emotive language, poetry about poetry. I suspect I wasn't entirely innocent of that myself. But I would like to end with a literary quote, not from Schulz, but one of Schulz's masters, perhaps, writers that he read and who probably influenced him, Thomas Mann. It is from Joseph and his brothers. As we know, the biblical Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. He's sold into slavery into Egypt. He rises to a prominent position in the household of his master, Potiphar, the steward of the house, and Joseph's overseer, Moncau, becomes almost his surrogate father. In this sense, Moncau, in this particular scene, Moncau is close to death, and he spends his days listening to Joseph's stories about the strange, faraway land of the Hebrews, and he muses. There was also a play of light and reflection between storyteller and story. The illusory light from the stories, the charm of the illusion, fell back on him who told them. And in turn, he also lent them something of his own person. That same person who had exchanged the veiled garment of love with his mother, and who in Moncau's eyes had always been a kind of amiable and roguish puzzle that engaged his mind from the very first moment when he had stood before him with the scroll and a smile that tempted the steward to confuse him with the ibis-headed god. The ibis-headed god is Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, art, and magic. A beautiful picture of an everlasting, eternal storyteller that I would like to end with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. Thank you for a great lecture and the wonderful journey through Schulz's universe, the mythical and the real world. So thank you again. My first question will be about your opinion about the film adaptations of Bruno Schulz. First one, the 1974, the Hourglass Sanatorium by Jerzy Wojciech, and the second, 1986, by Brothers Quay, The Street of Crocodiles. What do you think? What is your opinion?
It is very difficult, in my view, to adapt artistic prose, to translate artistic prose into any visual art. A visual form must always capture, that means literally trap, arrest a literary image into something much more physical, much more concrete material, static. Even if it's a movable image, motion picture. Ficowski, by the way, was always against any adaptations of Schulz. Schulz is what we have on the page, period. But we can at least try to recreate the mood, the texture of the language. Hasse's Sanatorium is closer to the original because it uses, it's a full-length feature film. It uses certain plot lines and dialogues from Schulz, not only from the story, the Sanatorium, the sign of the hourglass, but also from other stories. Brothers Quay are trying to recreate, this is an animation film, much shorter. They're using puppets and stop frame animation. They are trying to recreate that the way that I see it, this element that we talked about in the context of the treatise on mannequins, or that is the creation out of trash. Their puppets very often have heads of dolls, but they're made of pieces of wire, of scraps of fabric. The whole world in which they move is a junkyard, basically. A junkyard, a heap of rejected objects, and it's very interesting. It's very powerful, visually powerful. Both are powerful statements, cinematic statements. In my view, they both go too far into darkness, into horror, nightmare, macabre, which does exist in Schulz, but not to that extent, not to that degree. You know, for instance, the Sanatorium that I visualize, you know, by reading the novel, is a place that's empty, spooky, a little bit like the hotel in The Shining, in Kubrick's The Shining, but it's a place of some elegance, some formality. Here in Hasse's movie, it's a ruin. You know, it has no roof, no windows. It's, you know, everything falls down. In the Quay brothers movie, it's also a kind of horror atmosphere in it. But as I say, you know, they are works inspired by. They are not adaptations really. They are works inspired by Schulz. That's how I would describe it.
Thank you so much. I actually have a chance to talk to Wojciech Hass about Sanatorium. It was very interesting. Not the discussion, basically his monologue. And I agree about this nervous energy, this catastrophe. I think it couldn't be after the war, couldn't be different actually. And Brothers Quay imagination scares me a lot. It's really beyond my reading of Schulz. So thank you so much. We got a lot of greetings from different parts of the country, from LA, from Canada, from different parts of the world, from Canada, from UK, then from states, from Michigan, from California, from Seattle. Greetings and thank you. So that's lovely. And now let's go to the questions. I saw a very interesting one. Is it possible to identify a certain amount of Kafka's influence on Schulz?
Schulz is always connected with Kafka. He was presented to the West as the Polish Kafka, in a sense. Both writers, you know, from the Austro-Hungarian world. I do not see too many similarities between those, you know, two writers. Kafka's world is, I mean, it's also transformed, fantastic, you know, people turn into bugs and so on, but it is starkly realistic at the same time, you know. That means the person who suddenly wakes up as a huge cockroach lives the life of the average Austro-Hungarian Prague bureaucrat, at least tries to. Kafka's language is not particularly visual. He just describes things as they are in the way. And, you know, Joseph K. woke up and there are two people and two men in his room and so on and so on. Very matter-of-factly describing his world, which is, of course, fantastic and strange, but described as something which is kind of, we should take as something obvious, you know. It's not like that in Schulz. Schulz actually poeticizes the world, you know. Everything is flowing, everything is magical, you know. Schulz makes the average magical, and Kafka, in my view, makes magical seem like normal, like commonplace, in a sense. This connection between Schulz and Kafka was also caused by the fact that the first translation of the trial into Polish, Kafka's trial, is signed by Bruno Schulz. In fact, we know it already. This fact, it was done by Józefina Szelińska and his fiancée at that time, and he just he edited it apparently and put his name on it. So, and he writes about Kafka. He wrote an introduction to the novel, and in my view, he completely misreads Kafka in this introduction. He writes, you know, for us, you know, Kafka was always, you know, especially the trial kind of vision of a totalitarian system. You know, you are guilty until proven innocent. Someone declares you guilty without telling you what you're guilty, so you cannot even defend yourself because you don't know what you're accused of. And Schulz writes, you know, why does Joseph K. even resist those two men? You know, they are emissaries of another world, another order. They are angels. You know, he should follow them. He should follow them without questions. So I think that there is he obviously read the Kafka through his own vision, which I think do not really connect with him. But this connection is always made, you know, and some critics disavowed it already, but it keeps coming back, you know. Both great authors, you know, I was talking about this, you know, small volume, you know, great reputation based on a small volume of work, you know. Kafka is also an author of a relatively small volume of work, so they're bigger larger than Schulz. There is, you know, automatically they are put together. I think in terms of literary influences, I would say Rilke's prose is much closer to Schulz than Kafka.
Thank you so much. We have another interesting questions and comments. What is Pan Waldemar Kalinowski? What an interesting point bringing Olga Tokarczuk's Księgi Jakubowe into this conversation. Essentially a different kind of work from Schulz, but definitely tangential. Will have its English premiere in London, November, February in the USA. So here we go. We know when it will be on the market. And same readers is brilliant. Thank you. And Pan Mariusz Kociejewski is asking, did you see the theatrical version of The Street of Crocodiles by the theater The Complicit? So I didn't see it. I didn't know it. Have you?
No, unfortunately, no. Marius is my good friend, and he's one of the two poets that I mentioned at the very beginning, still living, and a great writer, poet, and recently author of wonderful books of prose, kind of travel prose, but very, very, very complex and interesting. Check him out. No, I haven't seen this production. I've heard about it. You know, unfortunately, I have not seen it. I don't know. Is it still available? Is it still recorded somewhere? You know, because is the available on YouTube versions? I don't know. Well, I have to check it. Thanks, Marius.
So the next one is from Ms. Grażyna Drabik. Do you think its uniqueness has something to do with Galicia and its particular cultural mixture? Schulz's position at the crossroads of the Polish, Yiddish, German, Ukrainian points of references.
Yes, very possibly. This area, as I said, moved through many countries, moved through many states. Stayed in the same place geographically, but moved from Austro-Hungarian Empire to Poland, and now it's part of the Soviet Ukraine, the Soviet Union, then now part of independent Ukraine. Drohobycz was sometimes called a city and a half, because people are saying it's half Jewish, half Polish, half Ukrainian. In reality, I think that about 30% of the population was Jewish, and the rest was divided almost equally between Poles and Ukrainians. They all lived together. Schulz's students, it was a public school. It was not a national or religious school, so they accepted students of all nationalities and religions, and his students, there were again about 25% of his students were Jewish, the rest were either Poles or Ukrainians. There was a lot of interaction. People say that relations were relatively good between those nationalities. Some say it wasn't as rosy as it is sometimes presented, but there are stories about a great rabbi, whom even Christians went to ask for his advice, and his funeral was attended by everybody. Yes, there was a mixture of cultures, there was a mixture of narratives, there was a mixture of nationalities. This might have been part of it. Schulz's world is Jewish. When you look at the persons that even Adela is not a Jewish name, but originally Adela was apparently planned to be a Jewish maid in the household. Here she's made as kind of indefinite nationality. But so his world, the world that we see in his prose, is Jewish. He was not very religious. He left the Jewish community, so being either the religion or even being part of the Jewish identity was not for him a matter of existential importance. Many critics, by the way, who wrote about him did not realize that he was Jewish. There were some innuendos in some criticism when they say that his Polish is not really Polish. It's not the Polish of a Pole, or that his imagination is kind of unhealthy. It's not a healthy Polish imagination. So there are nationalistic tendencies, but even writers, even critics associated with Endecja, the nationalist camp, avoided open attacks on him, which was not the case with many other Polish writers of this period who were of Jewish origin, of Jewish roots, like Tuwim, like Wierzyński, like Słonimski. They were viciously attacked, because they were probably more prominent and more influential. Schulz was marginal, But so his world is Jewish, and there is a lot of work being done by Professor Underwood, who recently spoke about Schulz in another series of literary meetings organized by the Polish Cultural Institute in New York. She's working on this subject, on the elements of Jewish mysticism in Schulz. I'm looking forward to reading her book that is forthcoming, I think, next year.
Thank you. And one more, what is Schulz's work's position in European world literature?
Well, I think, as I said, he is considered by literary society communities internationally as one of the, as I said, giants of European modernism. Is he widely read? Probably not, but he's popular enough to be used as a as a character, you know, like for instance, Cynthia Ozick, you know, the Messiah in Stockholm is about a Swedish Jew who believes that he's the son of Bruno Schulz, and he comes across something that may or may not be the manuscript of the Messiah. By the way, Schulz was in Stockholm once. He took a cruise on the Baltic and stayed for a day or two in Stockholm. Maybe he deposited the Messiah there, although I don't think it's very probable.
So to close, I would like to ask a very personal question. When you first time read the Schulz, and what was the first reaction, and why such an interest in his work?
Well, when was it? I think I was still in high school at that time. Probably it was the end of the high school. It was not an easy encounter. It was, I experienced a sense of fascination, but also strangeness. It was something that probably did not naturally speak to my mentality, which was kind of, I was trying at this time to figure out, understand the world in terms of ideas, in terms of logical, rationalistic interpretation. And we were reading at that time, I was reading, and people like me were reading Zbigniew Herbert, they were reading Tadeusz Różewicz, poets who had a very, I mean, there were poets with all the complexity that every poetry brings with it. There was kind of clarity of both, you know, a message, a purpose, a certain vision of our civilization. It could be translated into discursive sentences. And suddenly there was something else. And I felt that this is something really unusual and great. But I felt almost guilty being attracted to this world and kind of leaving apart, you know, my rationality and so on, and being kind of sucked into this world. But there was a challenge, and I think that prompted me, as always, school challenges, to go deeper, to try to reorganize, kind of refurnish my brain, and I think it worked. It worked great. Schulz is, as you said, one of my favorite writers. I was confused, just like those critics, you know, that I was talking about, was fascinated by confused, but I was not a critic. I was a high school kid, so I guess I can be excused.
Thank you so much. I will just read. YouTube has the Street of Crocodiles stage play by the Birmingham School of Acting. So on YouTube you have the part of the Street of Crocodiles as a film, Brothers Quay, but also thank you for this note. And on this note, bravo, informative and inspired discussion by both master translator and the gifted journalist. I will enjoy rereading both novels again, Miss Longia Miller. So I would like to thank you so much for this great meeting, and looking forward for the next part and talking about Gombrowicz, the bad boy of Polish literature. So thank you so much.
Thank you to Jaroslaw Anders for, as always, very informative and interesting talk. Thank you to Dr. Małgorzata Pośpiech for coming up with the initiative and running this discussion. I would like to also thank you all who joined in. I believe that attendees were based in all parts of this country and world. And thank you for very, very interesting questions as well. On maybe the last note, on the last note, the Kościuszko Foundation is nearly a century old organization. To those of you who are joining us for the first time, on average, the foundation awards $1 million a year in grants and fellowships and scholarships to both Polish and American students and scholars. And the foundation also promotes Polish culture and Polish literature through events and webinars such as this one. So if you are a member of the foundation, that's wonderful, thank you. If not, you're most welcome to join us as a member. And with this note, I would like to conclude this webinar, wishing you all a wonderful evening, night, and afternoon, depending where you are joining from. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.